house had been empty for months, not abandoned, just untouched. As if time had paused the moment she left, everything still smelled like lavender and old paper. Her teacups were stacked by the window. A half-finished crossword lay on the table, pen cap still chewed at the end. Her cardigan hung from the back of the kitchen chair, sleeves dangling like tired arms. I should have gotten rid of it all. Instead, I moved in. They said it would help with the grief, that returning to a familiar place might bring comfort. I wasn't sure if I believed them, but I didn't have anywhere else to go. The first day, I kept busy. Unpacking, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. I avoided the mirror in the hallway, not because I looked different, but because she had turned it to face the wall before she died. That night, I tried to sleep. The house made sounds, of course. It was old, wood settling, pipes twitching, wind tapping at the windows like a bored guest. I told myself it was nothing. But then the bell rang, a single low chime, then another, then a third, three. Not rushed, not chaotic, like a church bell from far away, muffled, yet clear enough to feel in your chest. I sat up, heart hammering. My first thought, lightning must have struck some tower nearby. But then I remembered there was no tower. No church for miles, and still I had heard it. I got out of bed, barefoot on cold wood. The fire was dying. The clock on the wall ticked softly, steady as breath. 12:00, midnight, right on the hour. I opened the window. Nothing. Just the fog clinging to the treetops and a sky too empty for comfort. I went outside. The air was sharp, wet with silence. I stood on the porch listening. The bell was gone. No echoes, no follow-up. Just that lingering feeling in my stomach, like I'd just missed something, or something had just noticed me. Eventually I went back inside, locked the door, left the lights on, told myself I was tired, that grief plays tricks. That maybe I had imagined it, but I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared, but because deep down I knew the truth. That bell would ring again, and next time. I might not be the only one who hears it. The next morning the world was painfully normal. Sunlight leaked through the kitchen curtains. Birds chirped like they hadn't slept through something wrong. The kettle whistled just the same. I almost believed it hadn't happened. But then I glanced at the clock, 12:00, and I remembered every note of that bell, how it rang through me more than around me, how it felt less like a sound and more like a signal. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Stress, grief, the brain's way of mourning. By mid-morning, I convinced myself well enough to try asking someone. The only neighbor nearby was an elderly woman named Elspeth who lived 2 hills down. She was one of those people who always knew who died, who was born, and when the last real storm came. If there had been a bell, she'd know. I walked over just before noon. She opened the door before I could knock, like she'd been watching the path. Her smile was polite, distant. I asked her casually, "Hey, weird question, but did you hear a bell last night, around midnight?" Her expression didn't change. Then she laughed, a small, breathless chuckle. "A bell at midnight," she shook her head. "No church out here anymore, dear. Closest one's 2 towns over, been like that for decades." I nodded, tried to smile. Right, I figured. Just thought I heard something. Elsbeth squinted at me. "You all right?" she asked. "You've looked pale since you moved back." I lied, "Just tired." She nodded once, but something in her eyes lingered a little too long. Not suspicion. Recognition. On the walk back, I tried to forget how tightly she gripped the edge of her shawl when I asked about the bell. That night, I left the lights on. I sat by the front window with a book open in my lap and a candle lit beside me, though I didn't read a word. I waited, and right on time. It rang 3 chimes, soft, measured, hollow. No one outside, no wind, no sound except for those bells and the blood in my ears. I looked at the clock. 12:00, again, exactly. I didn't go outside this time. I just sat there, hands trembling on the closed book, watching my reflection in the dark glass of the window, and I whispered something I hadn't meant to say out loud. I didn't imagine it. What? Because denial only works when the world lets you lie to yourself. But the bell wasn't interested in lies, it only cared about time, and it rang for someone, me. The third night I stayed awake on purpose. No candles. No distractions, just me, sitting in the dark at the kitchen table with the clock ticking louder than it had any right to. I watched the seconds bleed toward midnight, and when the final tick struck 12:00, it came. 3 chimes, exactly spaced, deep, distant, deliberate. This time I didn't move, I just listened, let it wash over me, let it press into the bones behind my eyes and the part of my chest that always aches after crying. Then I noticed something else. The photo was missing, a small framed picture of my mother. It had sat for years on the windowsill above the sink. I remembered seeing it that afternoon when I did the dishes. She was holding me as a baby, laughing at something beyond the camera. Now the frame was still there, but the photo was gone, not fallen, not slipped behind the cabinet, just gone. I searched the kitchen, the floor, the drawers, nothing. I told myself it was forgetfulness, that maybe I moved it and didn't remember. that maybe it had fallen somewhere strange, but I knew the truth already. The bell had taken it. The thought came uninvited, like a whisper that wasn't mine. And once it arrived, I started to notice the rest. The fourth night it was the teacup, my mother's favorite, the one with the cracked handle. I had used it that morning, left it on the counter. Gone. The fifth night, a letter. An old one she had written to my father but never sent. I had kept it folded inside a drawer tucked between books. I opened the drawer just after the third bell. Empty. Each time the bell rang, something vanished. Never big, never loud. But always personal, always hers. I started marking what was where, sticky notes, lists, photographs of shelves before midnight. Still, items disappeared, but only those tied to her. By the sixth night, I stopped trying to explain it away. It wasn't grief. It wasn't sleep deprivation. It wasn't some slow breakdown of memory. It was a pattern. The bell rang, and something left with it, like it was counting down. Or collecting. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew I was, because something else was changing too. The house was getting quieter, too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't just come from silence. The kind that feels like absence. Something wasn't just taking her things, it was trying to take her, or what was left of her. And worse, I was starting to feel like I was the one holding the door open. It started with a box I shouldn't have opened. I found it in the back of my mother's old wardrobe, tucked behind winter coats that still held her perfume. The box was wooden, carved with tiny tulips along the lid. No key. Just a rusted latch that clicked open too easily. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Most were black and white, curled at the edges with time. My mother as a child, my grandparents unsmiling in front of the old oak tree. A birthday cake with too many candles and no one blowing them out. I sat cross-legged on the floor, letting them spill into my lap. Then I found the one, a faded photo, colored barely. My mother stood in front of what looked like a bell tower. Stone, weather-worn, ivy crawling up the sides. She was young, maybe 20, smiling nervously, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. But she wasn't alone. To her left, half in shadow, stood a boy, small, maybe 10 years old, thin arms. White shirt, no expression. At first I thought nothing of it. A random child caught in frame, but the longer I looked, the more I realized I didn't recognize him. And his eyes, black smudges where pupils should have been, seemed to stare directly at me. I flipped the photo over, no date, no writing, just the scratch of old ink that had faded into nothing. I searched the box for more, and there he was again, 3 times, always near my mother, never touching, always looking straight ahead. In one, she's seated on a bench in autumn, leaves all around her feet. The boy stands behind her, hands at his sides, face turned slightly toward her neck. In another, she's holding a cat. The boy is across the yard, arms stiff at his sides, half obscured by a tree. The third one. She's in front of the house, this house, and the boy is at the window, my window. I dropped the photos, heart racing, hands clammy. I had never seen him before. She never spoke of siblings, no cousins, no adopted children, nothing, and yet he was always there, always near her, always watching. I picked up the first photo again, the one with the tower. Zoomed in as much as I could. There were no visible doors on the tower, no windows, just stone and shadow. I looked up. It felt like something in the house shifted, like a presence had leaned closer to see what I was holding. I placed the photos back into the box, but as I closed the lid, I caught a glimpse of one corner of the bell tower photo, and something was different. The boy was gone, not faded, gone. The space where he stood was empty now. As if the photo had adjusted, erased him, or as if he had stepped out. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid of the bell, but because I kept thinking. If he was always with her, was he now with me? It changed on the 7th night. Until then, it had always been 3 chimes, precise, predictable, haunting, yes, but in a way I could prepare for. A rhythm to dread, but a rhythm nonetheless. But that night, there was a 4th. The first 3 came as usual, dong, dong, dong. I sat frozen on the couch, arms pulled tightly around myself, waiting for the silence to return. But then, dong, a 4th, lower, slower, like the bell had been struck with something heavier. Or older. I stood up without realizing I had moved. Something in me pulled toward the stairs, toward the attic door I hadn't opened since moving in. And then I heard it, footsteps, above me, heavy, deliberate. Moving across the attic floorboards directly overhead. My blood went cold. I knew that sound, the difference between old wood creaking and something walking. There was no mistaking it. Each step came with just enough pause to remind me that whatever was up there was pacing. Waiting, I stared at the ceiling. Then I ran, not outside, not into the night, but upstairs, because I couldn't bear the not knowing anymore. Couldn't sit there another night with unanswered questions chewing holes in my sanity. The attic door was at the end of the hall, small, square, with a string that dangled like a noose. I pulled it. The ladder creaked down slowly. Dust rained from the hatch. I climbed up. The attic was dark, except for a single candle burning in the far corner. I hadn't lit it, no one had, but it burned, unmoving, casting light over an object placed directly beneath it, a piece of paper. I stepped toward it, feeling the floor moan beneath my weight. The paper was folded neatly, tucked under a stone as if someone or something didn't want it to blow away. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was written in her handwriting. My mother S. I would recognize that crooked loop on her Y anywhere, and the note was short, just one sentence. Do not answer the fifth bell. I didn't breathe, I didn't move. I just stood there in that quiet, candlelit attic, holding a message from someone who was long gone, a warning from beyond her own death, a rule written for me, because she had heard it too. She knew the bell, knew what it was. Knew what came with it. I folded the note, kept it in my pocket, blew out the candle, and descended the ladder as slowly as I had climbed it. The rest of the night passed in silence. No more footsteps, but I didn't sleep. Because now I knew two things I hadn't before. The bell could change, and it was building towards something worse than echo or absence, something that came after the fifth ring. There is a kind of silence that is not quiet at all. It hums. It breathes, it watches. In the mornings, I would sit at the kitchen table with my mother's teacup, the one that hadn't yet disappeared, and listen to the stillness of the house. At first, I found it comforting. After the bell had rung, after the notes had stopped hanging in the night air like threads cut mid-motion, the house would settle into this breathless calm. But then the calm began to sound wrong, too still, not empty, but waiting. Like the quiet you hear in a room where someone was just speaking and left, but their voice still lingers, pressed into the wallpaper, clinging to the beams in the ceiling. It was subtle at first. Barely more than a tremble in the walls, a shifting in the floor beneath my feet. The kind of thing you'd blame on old wood, on changes in temperature, on a breeze slipping through the cracks. But there were no breezes. And the house was not settling, it was murmuring. One morning, as I walked past the hallway that led to the attic, I heard what I thought was my name, not clearly, not like a call. More like the sound of someone breathing it in, as if inhaling the syllables of who I was. I stopped, turned, waited. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but my heart beat with the certainty that someone or something had just turned away. At first I dismissed it. Grief, I said, sleep deprivation. My mind grasping for patterns, but the whispers returned, not always in words but in shapes that curled just behind sound. In the living room I began to notice a faint scratching behind the walls, like nails brushing against old plaster. In the bathroom, the mirror fogged over even when I hadn't run water, and when I wiped it clean, I could swear I saw something behind me, standing just beyond the doorframe, gone the second I turned. But the worst was the bedroom, my mother's old room. I hadn't slept there, not once since moving in. Something about the smell, faded lilac, soap, and something older, something sweet that had gone sour, made me avoid it entirely. Still, one evening I stood just outside the door, pressing my palm flat against the wood. I didn't open it, I didn't need to, because from the other side I heard them, a chorus of small voices, children maybe, laughing softly. Then a single, fragile whisper that rose above them all, "He doesn't want to be alone again." My hand dropped, I backed away, and for the first time since the bell began, I felt truly unwelcome in the house that bore my name. That night I tried to write everything down. I opened my journal, the one I'd used since college, pages filled with old grocery lists, poems, notes to myself about heartbreak and hope, and turned to a blank sheet. But my hand froze before the pen touched paper, because as I stared at the page, the lines began to warp. The ink began to form not words of mine, but hers, my mother S. A single sentence I recognized from a letter she wrote after my father left. There are some sounds we carry with us long after they've stopped. The pen dropped, I closed the book, and in the dark the walls began to breathe again, not with air, but with memory, with something that wasn't finished speaking. I began walking further each day, as if putting distance between myself and the house would lessen the weight of what had rooted itself inside it. The trees that flanked the property had always been tall, but now they felt like columns, like walls in a cathedral whose ceiling I could no longer see. Every path I took seemed to lead somewhere quieter than before, not peaceful quiet, but muffled, like the world was being padded with something thick and invisible. Even the birds had begun to leave. Their absence made the sky feel hollow. I walked for hours, sometimes with no destination in mind, sometimes toward the vague memory of a store, a road sign, a town, but nothing ever looked quite as I remembered. Roads curved strangely, forest lines had shifted. Once I turned a corner I thought would lead to Elspeth's cottage, only to find the hill too steep, the trees unfamiliar, and no house in sight. When I finally turned back, I felt a strange resistance in my body, as if my bones wanted to keep walking even as my feet refused. It was during one of these wanderings, just before dusk, that I saw it. At first I thought it was just the light playing tricks on me, how the fog settled into shapes between trees, how dusk made silhouettes out of broken fences and half-dead oaks. But this wasn't a shape born from imagination. It had edges, structure, presence, a tower, stone, tall, narrow at the top, covered in ivy that didn't move with the wind. And at its peak, barely visible through the blue-gray haze of fading day, a bell, hung still but heavy. I knew it before I truly saw it. I knew it the way you know something from a dream long buried. Not through sight but through recognition that claws its way up your spine. I stepped forward, branches snapped underfoot, the air thickened the closer I got, and as I reached the clearing, a hollowed space I had never seen before, though I had walked this way many times, I stopped. Because the tower was not whole, it flickered, not like light, like memory. It would blur slightly at the edges, then sharpen again, like it was trying to decide whether to stay or fade. One moment it stood tall in full form, the next, its stones shimmered, thin as breath. I blinked and it seemed to bend, not physically, but in time. As if I was seeing something too old to be seen, something held together by attention alone. Then I heard leaves crunch behind me. I turned, startled, but there was only a child, maybe 7 years old, standing a few feet away. I didn't recognize her. She stared at the tower too, though I wasn't sure if her eyes were focused or unfocused, like she wasn't really looking at it but through it. I opened my mouth to ask, but she spoke first. Her voice was soft, flat. "You see it now." What? I nodded slowly, the words stuck behind my teeth. "Only the ones at once come close," she said. I finally managed to speak. "What is it?" She looked at me then, eyes too dark for the fading light. "It was never built," she said. "It's always been." And with that, she turned and walked into the woods, disappearing between the trees with no sound at all. I looked back at the tower. The bell at the top swayed slightly, not from wind, from breath, as if it knew I had seen it. As if it had been waiting, I stepped back and the tower blinked out. Gone, nothing but a ring of scorched grass where it had stood, nothing but my own heart, still beating to a rhythm I couldn't name. I went home with dirt on my shoes and something colder behind my ribs. And that night, when the bell rang, it echoed not just outside, but from somewhere deep beneath the floor, dark, still water, too still to be real. I stood ankle-deep in it, my reflection faint beneath the surface, not because of ripples, but because there was something else down there. Something with my shape, but not my posture, not my eyes. The trees around me stretched upward without end, their trunks blackened as if burned from within, yet none bore the scent of ash. And ahead of me, just barely visible through the thin fog that clung to the ground like skin, rose the tower. It didn't flicker here, it loomed, complete, cold, watching. The stone was the color of old teeth. Its surface pulsed faintly, not with light, but with the memory of something that once lived in it, or still did. Ivy clung to it like veins. The bell swayed, not as if moved by wind, but pulled gently by something unseen, or something waiting for the right hands. I walked toward it without question, not because I wanted to, but because the dream offered no other direction. Inside, the air was thick, not warm, not cold, just heavy, like grief. The spiral staircase had no railing, just steps, chipped and wet with moss, winding up into blackness. I climbed, barefoot, my fingers brushing against the stone as if reacquainting themselves with an old memory. I should have been afraid of falling, but something beneath me pushed upward, like the tower itself needed me to reach the top. And then I was there, a single chamber, circular, windowless. The bell hung in the center, suspended not by beam or chain, but by silence. Beneath it, a rope, frayed, worn, familiar, and standing across from it was me. Or something wearing my face. It was not a mirror. The movements were not mine. My dream self stood still, while the other one, the other me, moved with slow, deliberate purpose. She gripped the rope, pulled once, dong. The sound rolled outward but did not fade. It coiled, doubled back, and sank into the floor beneath our feet. Another pull, dong. This time I felt it in my chest, not like thunder, but like a memory returning too fast, too hard. Then the final pull, dong. The third ring shook the walls, cracks spiderwebbed along the stone, and the other me turned her head not to face me but to look through me. Her eyes were not eyes. They were hollows filled with something ancient, something that had waited for a body, a voice, a tether. She opened her mouth, but no words came, only the sound of the bell again, a fourth toll, then a fifth. And with the fifth ring, the tower began to breathe, not collapse, not dissolve, breathe, inhale, the stones pulling inward, the space constricting, the rope drawing tighter like a muscle flexing. Exhale. A whisper pouring from the cracks, a name I couldn't remember ever hearing, but knew belonged to me. My knees buckled, I fell. The stone floor vanished beneath me, and the bell's tolls stretched into something deeper, lower, no longer a sound, but a command. When I woke, my ears were ringing. My hands were blackened with soot, and clutched in my palm, wrapped so tightly I had to peel my fingers back one by one. A piece of rope, frayed, wet, still warm. There are certain moments in life that feel rehearsed, déjà vu carved deep into the marrow. You don't realize it at first, not until it happens, not until the air stills in a way that's too intentional, too exact. The sky that night was wrong, not stormy, not dark, just still, dead still, no crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the wind dared speak. The moon hung behind a gauze of clouds, pale and disinterested. And inside the house, I sat in the exact same chair I'd sat in for the last 8 nights, watching the clock tick its way toward midnight, pretending that I could make a different choice this time, even though the dream had already told me otherwise. The journal lay open on the table. I had started to write again, though the words weren't really mine. They came in fragments, in someone else's voice, half sentences like "he remembers the quiet" or "the door is not locked from the outside." Things that felt more like recovered thoughts than fresh ones. My handwriting changed midline now, slanted, hurried, as though I was racing to record something before it faded, except I couldn't remember ever thinking it. 11:58. I could feel the pressure building, the way a room changes before a thunderclap, but this wasn't electricity. This was deeper, denser. It was as if the walls were bracing themselves, as if the house knew what was coming and had long since stopped trying to stop it. 11:59, the candle flickered, the clock's second hand slowed. Not literally, it was still moving, but my perception of it warped, like I was watching time bend through warped glass. 12:0. The first chime hit like it always did, low, melancholy, the kind of sound that made your stomach twist for reasons you couldn't name. Dong, then the second, dong the third, slower this time, dong the fourth, heavy, close. So close it felt like it came from within the room. Dong, I didn't move, didn't breathe, because I could feel it, the fifth was coming, and I remembered the warning. The note in my pocket, now stained with sweat and soot, my mother's words. Do not answer the fifth bell, but what did it mean to answer, to open the door, to speak, to listen? The fifth toll struck before I could decide, but it didn't come from outside, it came from behind me. The sound passed through my spine like a blade of frozen wind. My vision blurred, the candle extinguished without a gust, and in the sudden dark, the silence that followed wasn't absence, it was awareness. I turned slowly, every part of me resisting the motion, as if my body understood what my mind still refused to accept. The hallway was dark, but not empty. A shadow stood at the far end, where the attic string hung limply like a forgotten warning. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It had no eyes, but it was looking. It had no mouth, but I could feel it speaking. Not aloud, but inside me. You pulled the rope, it said, not in words, but in the cold sweat on my skin, in the pressure blooming behind my teeth. You called it awake. I tried to move, to speak, to cry, but all I managed was a whisper, hoarse and cracked. I didn't mean to. The thing in the hallway tilted its head, or maybe the walls tilted around it. It stepped forward once. The floor didn't creak, my breath caught, and then it stopped. The bell rang again, a sixth time. Only this time no one heard it but me, because this wasn't a sound anymore, it was a binding, and as the echo faded, so did the world. Not all at once, but piece by piece, photographs, doors, time, and when I looked down at my hands, they were already beginning to blur. Morning arrived without sunlight. Not because the sky was dark, the sky in fact was blindingly pale, a white so flat and textureless it felt artificial. There were no clouds, no shadows, no movement in the trees. Just that sterile blank light that made everything look overexposed, bleached of life. I opened the door to silence. Not the familiar kind, not the peace that follows snow or the hush of dawn before the birds stir. This silence was wrong. Sterile, hollow, it didn't just hang in the air, it replaced the air. I stepped outside barefoot. The grass felt stiff beneath my feet, like brittle paper. The path I always took to the village lay ahead, but it looked different now, straighter, sharper, as though it had been drawn in with a ruler instead of worn by footsteps. I told myself I'd just walk until I saw someone, anyone, and laugh this away like a bad dream I couldn't shake. But the further I walked, the more I felt it. There were no birds, no wind, no insects humming in the trees. Just the sound of my own breathing, loud and foreign in this flat, forgotten world. The village was still standing, but it wasn't alive. Windows were closed, doors shut tight. No movement inside, no flicker of curtains, no noise behind walls. I knocked once, twice, a third time, no answer. At Elspeth's cottage, her rocking chair still swayed gently on the porch, but no one sat in it. The cup she always left out for tea was there, but the tea inside was still steaming, as if someone had just left and never returned. I ran from house to house, no footprints, no tire tracks, no animals. Just stillness, heavy, pressing stillness that made my lungs ache like I was breathing in dust that hadn't moved in centuries. At the church, the bell tower that wasn't supposed to exist was now there, full and undeniable in the daylight. The stones no longer flickered, they were solid, rooted, hungry. The bell itself no longer hung still, it swayed slowly, steadily, as if caught in a wind that didn't touch anything else. And then I realized it wasn't swaying, it was breathing. I backed away slowly, heart thudding. I wanted to scream, to call out, to hear a voice that wasn't mine just once, but my throat had closed, or the air wouldn't carry it, or sound no longer traveled here. I returned to the house. Or what was left of it. Inside, everything was clean, too clean, as if no one had ever lived there at all. The photographs were gone, the furniture pale, unmarked, no dust, no scent, no memory. Even the journals I'd written in, the ones filled with my handwriting, my thoughts, my fear, now lay blank, as if the words had never settled deep enough to stay. Only the attic door remained open, and the rope still hung. It moved gently with the still air, swaying like a cradle or a trap. I stood beneath it for a long time, listening for the bell, but it didn't ring, because it didn't need to. It had already done what it came to do. The world was not ending. It had simply shifted, tilted on its axis just slightly enough that no one else noticed, because no one else was here anymore. I was no longer waiting for the midnight bell. I was inside it, and outside was nothing, just silence. A stillness that had finally closed its eyes, and all that remained was me, standing in the last breath of a world that forgot how to exhale.